Have you ever spent years dreaming about something, only to discover, just before it became reality, that you had missed one small detail that changed everything? That's exactly what happened to David. David was 62 years old. He had worked since he was 19. 43 years. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't poor, he was what most people would call responsible. He and his wife had raised 2 children, paid off almost all of their mortgage, stayed out of credit card debt, saved faithfully for retirement, nothing flashy, just decades of doing the right things, and finally, the finish line was in sight. His last day at work was only 6 weeks away. His co-workers had already started asking where he planned to travel. His daughter joked that he was finally going to wear out the fishing boat instead of himself. For the first time in years, David allowed himself to imagine what life might look like without an alarm clock. Slow mornings, coffee on the back porch, helping with the grandkids, serving more at church, maybe even taking that road trip he and his wife had talked about for years. It felt like freedom. Then one Tuesday evening, everything changed. David wasn't looking at the stock market. He wasn't watching the news. He wasn't reading another article predicting a recession. He was sitting at his kitchen table with a laptop, trying to answer one simple question. What are we going to do about health insurance? At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. After all, he'd had insurance through work for more than 40 years. Surely replacing it couldn't be that complicated. He clicked, he searched, he compared, then he stopped. He looked across the table at his wife. I don't think we planned for this. The room became very quiet. Not because they had discovered they were broke, they weren't. Not because the market had crashed, it hadn't. Not because they had made some terrible financial mistake, they hadn't. It was something much more dangerous. They had overlooked one expense that had quietly been hiding in the background for decades. An expense they had never really needed to think about because his employer had always handled it. Now that safety net was about to disappear. David later told a friend something I'll never forget. For years, I thought retirement was a savings problem. I discovered it was also a planning problem. I think that's one of the wisest observations I've ever heard, because most people spend decades asking one question. Will I have enough money to retire? It's an important question. But I don't think it's the first question. The first question is this: what changes the day my paycheck stops? That question changes everything. Your income changes, your taxes change, how you withdraw money changes, your daily routine changes. And if you're retiring before 65, your health care changes. That's the part many people never see coming. Not because they're careless, because they've never had to think about it before. If you're somewhere between 55 and 64, if retirement has started showing up in your conversations, if you've ever wondered whether you could afford to leave work before Medicare begins, I want to help you avoid the surprise David experienced, not by filling your head with complicated insurance terms, not by trying to scare you, but by showing you how one overlooked piece of the puzzle can be planned for before it becomes a crisis. Because here's what I've learned: retirement shouldn't begin with panic. It should begin with peace, and peace almost always comes from preparation. Let's build that preparation together. The next morning, David did something most people never do. He stopped guessing. Instead of asking friends what they thought health insurance might cost, instead of reading random comments online, instead of hoping it would all work itself out, he decided to find real answers. And that's where the second surprise hit him. The cost wasn't the first problem. The uncertainty was. Every article seemed to say something different. One person claimed health insurance before Medicare was impossibly expensive. Another insisted it wasn't a big deal. Some people talked about government assistance. Others never mentioned it. The more David read, the more confused he became. Maybe you felt that way too. There's so much information available today that sometimes it becomes harder, not easier, to make a decision. That's why I want to simplify this. Forget the numbers for just a minute. Forget the websites, forget what your neighbor told you over coffee. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Imagine you're building a bridge across a river. You've been building it your entire working life. Every paycheck you've saved, every dollar invested, every mortgage payment, every sacrifice, every decision to live below your means. Board by board, year after year, you've been building a bridge toward retirement. Most people spend 40 years building that bridge, but many unknowingly stop about 50 feet too soon. That last section of the bridge is the time between leaving your employer and becoming eligible for Medicare. If you don't plan for those years, it's like arriving at the edge of the river and realizing there's still a gap between you and the other side. That doesn't mean the bridge has failed. It means one section still needs to be built. I love that picture because it changes the conversation. This isn't about fear. It's about finishing what you've already started. David didn't need to start over. He didn't need another 20 years of work. He simply needed to build the last section of the bridge. That's a completely different problem, and different problems have solutions. As David kept researching, something became clear. The question wasn't, can I retire? The better question was, what will it take to retire well? Those are not the same question. One asks whether retirement is possible, the other asks whether retirement will be peaceful. That one shift in thinking changed everything. Instead of searching for the cheapest answer, David started looking for the wisest one. And I think that's the turning point for every successful retirement. Not finding a perfect plan, finding an honest one. The Bible says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to abundance." I've always appreciated that verse because it reminds me that God honors thoughtful preparation. Planning isn't the opposite of faith. Planning is one of the ways we practice faithful stewardship. David wasn't losing faith. He was replacing assumptions with wisdom. Let me show you why this matters with a simple example. Imagine two people. Both have saved $1 million for retirement. Both plan to withdraw about 4% a year. On paper, they look identical. If you saw those numbers, you'd probably say they're both ready to retire. But now let's change just one thing. The first person has already reached Medicare eligibility. The second wants to retire 3 years earlier. Everything else stays the same retirement account, the same investments, the same house, the same lifestyle, the same dreams. There's only one difference. For the next 3 years, the second person has to pay for health insurance before Medicare begins. Suddenly, those retirement savings have another job. They're no longer just providing income. They're also replacing a benefit that used to come from an employer. Do you see what happened? Nothing about their savings changed, nothing about the stock market changed, nothing about Social Security changed, one line in the budget changed, but that one line has the power to affect everything else. That's why I keep saying this isn't really a healthcare story. It's a retirement story. Healthcare is simply the obstacle standing between where you are today and the retirement you've worked decades to build. David finally understood that. His problem wasn't that he had failed to save. His problem was that one piece of the bridge hadn't been finished. Once he saw that, he stopped asking, "Can I afford to retire?" and started asking, "How do I finish building the bridge?" Those are two completely different questions, and one leads to far better decisions than the other. The first thing David realized was almost embarrassingly simple. He had been trying to answer the wrong question. For weeks, he had been asking, "How much does health insurance cost?" But that wasn't really the question. The better question was, "What will health insurance cost me?" Those are two very different conversations. The answer depends on where you live. It depends on your income. It depends on the type of coverage you choose. And it depends on your own circumstances. In other words, there isn't one magic number that fits everyone. Once David understood that, something changed. He stopped looking for someone else's answer. He started building his own plan. I think that's one of the greatest mistakes people make as retirement gets closer. We compare. We compare our savings to someone else's. We compare retirement ages. We compare investment balances. We compare stories. My brother retired at 62. My neighbor says healthcare wasn't that expensive. My friend told me, "But your retirement isn't your neighbor's retirement. God hasn't called you to faithfully steward your neighbor's resources. He's called you to faithfully steward yours." David closed the laptop for a moment and looked at the yellow legal pad in front of him. Until then, healthcare had been one line on the page, one estimate, one guess. Now he started asking better questions. What if this costs more than I expected? Have I included deductibles? What about prescriptions? What if one of us has an unexpected medical issue during those first few years? Suddenly, the retirement budget wasn't just a spreadsheet. It became a plan, an honest plan, and there's something incredibly freeing about honesty. An honest plan may tell you that you can retire exactly when you hoped. It may tell you that you need to make a few adjustments. Or it may tell you that waiting another year will completely change your financial picture. None of those answers should scare you, because every one of them is better than being surprised after you've already retired. Jesus once asked, "Who, wanting to build a tower, doesn't first sit down and calculate the cost to see if he has enough to complete it?" I've read that passage many times over the years. Every time I do, I'm reminded that Jesus wasn't criticizing planning, he was praising it. Wise people count the cost before they begin. That's exactly what David was doing. He wasn't questioning God's provision. He was honoring God by preparing carefully for the future, and that one change in perspective transformed the atmosphere around the kitchen table. The fear that had filled the room a few days earlier began to fade, not because all the answers had appeared overnight, but because uncertainty was slowly being replaced with understanding. Then David made another discovery. Looking back years later, he would say, "That decision may have saved my retirement, and it had nothing to do with picking a different insurance plan. That decision wasn't exciting, it wasn't dramatic. In fact, it was the one David least wanted to make." He looked at his wife and said, "What if we worked one more year?" The words hung in the air. 6 weeks earlier, that idea would have felt like failure. Now it felt like wisdom. Together, they began running the numbers again. One more year of income, one more year without drawing from their retirement savings, one more year of employer-sponsored health insurance, one more year of retirement contributions, one more year for their investments to keep growing, one more year to reduce the uncertainty that had stolen their peace. Something remarkable happened. The retirement they thought they were losing actually became stronger. They weren't moving farther away from retirement. They were building the last section of the bridge, and once they saw it that way, the decision became much easier. Now I know what some of you are thinking. What if I can't work another year? That's a fair question. Not everyone has that option. Health issues, family responsibilities, job circumstances. Life doesn't always give us the freedom to choose our timeline, but the principle is still the same. Make your decision with your eyes open. Whether you retire next month, next year, or 3 years from now, let it be, because you've carefully weighed the costs, explored your options, and built a plan you can live with. The goal isn't to retire as early as possible. The goal is to retire as wisely as possible. For some people, that may mean leaving work at 62. For others, it may mean 65 or beyond. Neither date makes you successful. Wisdom does. I think that's one of the biggest lies our culture tells us. It says retirement is a finish line. Cross it as quickly as you can. The Bible paints a different picture. Life isn't a race to stop working. It's a lifelong calling to faithfully steward what God has entrusted to us in every season. Work is a season. Retirement is a season. Both can honor God. Both can be deeply meaningful. David finally understood that. He stopped asking, "How soon can I retire?" and started asking, "How can I retire well?" That one question changed everything. About 11 months later, David walked out of his office carrying the same small box he'd packed almost a year earlier. This time, there was no knot in his stomach, no second guessing, no wondering if he'd overlooked something important. He hugged a few coworkers, shook a few hands, climbed into his truck, and as he pulled out of the parking lot for the last time, he smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because he knew he had prepared wisely. He hadn't just hoped retirement would work, he had built a bridge all the way to the other side, and that's what I want for you. Before we finish, I want to ask you one question. If you were sitting across the kitchen table from David tonight, what would you tell him? Would you tell him to ignore the numbers and hope for the best? Probably not. Would you tell him to panic because retirement was impossible? I don't think so. You'd probably tell him exactly what he eventually told himself. Let's make the wisest decision we can with the information we have. That's all any of us can do. Maybe after watching this, you'll discover that you're in better shape than you thought. I hope that's true. Or maybe you'll discover there's one more section of the bridge you still need to build. If that's the case, don't be discouraged. Be grateful. You found the gap before you stepped into it. That's not bad news. That's an opportunity. A few months after David retired, a friend asked him if working that extra year had been worth it. He smiled and said, "I thought I was giving up a year." Looking back, I think I bought myself 20 years of peace. I don't know if your story will look exactly like David's, but I hope you'll be able to say the same thing one day. Sit down with your spouse if you're married. Pull out your retirement plan. Write down one simple question. What will healthcare cost us until Medicare begins? Then go find the answer. Not an estimate from a friend, not a comment on social media. Find the answer that fits your situation. You may discover that you're ready. You may discover you need to make a few adjustments. Either way, you'll replace uncertainty with understanding, and that's how confidence is built. One careful decision at a time. One of my favorite verses in Proverbs says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths." Notice what that verse doesn't say. It doesn't say don't make plans. It doesn't say ignore the details. It doesn't say faith means never asking questions. It tells us where our ultimate confidence belongs. We plan diligently. We seek wisdom. We ask good questions. We get wise counsel. And after we've done those things, we trust God with the outcome. That's the kind of retirement I want for you. Not one built on fear, not one built on wishful thinking. A retirement built on wisdom, faithful stewardship, and confidence that God will walk with you into every new season of life. If this conversation encouraged you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to Wisdom and Wealth. Every week we talk about retirement, money, and biblical wisdom to help Christians over 50 make decisions with greater confidence and greater peace. And don't stop here. The next video on your screen covers another retirement mistake that quietly costs many people thousands of dollars. If today's conversation helped you, I think that one will too. Until next time, keep building wisely. The finish line isn't just retirement, it's finishing well.